Hey everybody, my name is Mike McGahey and today I'm going to be talking about my case study, Frankenfoods. What, when, and why? Monsanto in 1996 exported genetically modified soybeans to Europe. Europeans did not take well to it, aligning it with mad cow disease. The EU placed a ban on the GMO produce, and the US appealed the EU ban on the import of genetically modified foods. In May of 2003, the United States filed a complaint with the World Trade Organization in hopes of getting the ban lifted. Britain's Daily Mirror ran a front page headline in 1998 warning against, quote, Frankenfoods. Basically, they felt that they were this stitched up, genetically weird, modified foods, and they wanted nothing to do with it. And in 1998, 5 European countries said they wouldn't process any more applications for genetically modified crops, and the EU upheld this decision. In response, in the summer of 2003, the European Parliament passed groundbreaking legislation that would require detailed labeling of all food products containing as little as 0.9% of genetically modified ingredients and would require origin tracing in order to gain approval. So the European Parliament was cracking down on these GMOs and they wanted absolutely nothing to do with them. As little as 0.9%, that's being very, very picky. The United States government and industry argued that the EU was in violation of World Trade Organization provisions requiring non-discriminatory treatment of like or similar foods. So the government felt that these foods were not all that different according to Americans. So what was the problem with the European Union? The Americans contended that uninformed Europeans were spreading unfounded fears about genetically modified organisms. Most studies to date seem to point to the conclusion that foods containing GMOs are safe for human consumption. But the fact that a majority of these studies were conducted by or for US biotech firms, independent of any third-party overseers, suggests to some that the findings are suspect. This isn't painting the biotech firms in a good light, obviously. If you want to make sure that people really believe that nothing is up your sleeve, you're probably not going to want to conduct the test yourself and then claim that everything is okay. In 1997, the United States won a complaint with the World Trade Organization against the EU concerning an EU ban on a hormone-treated beef. But the EU continued to enforce the broader ban on approval of newly introduced GMO products because a large majority of Europeans are steadfastly against the use of GMOs. The United States, along with Canada and Argentina, filed another complaint with the World Trade Organization in 2003, claiming the EU's ban on genetically modified products violates international trade rules. In 2006, the World Trade Organization ruled in favor of the United States, claiming that the EU had indeed violated recognized trade rules. Now, the EU is seeking to limit GMO sales through tougher approval processes. The United States government believes that genetically modified products could reduce hunger and poverty in the world's poorest nations, and that by restricting the use of GMOs, the EU is aggravating starvation in the developing world. And this is an interesting argument because I actually do think they hold some ground here. If the United States biotech companies are able to sell to these poor nations and allow them to, grow crops at a rate that wouldn't be allowed with, unfertile soil and droughts and whatnot with these GMOs, that could be possible. Biotechnology, according to the US policymakers and biotech executives, offers the prospect of crops that are more resilient, require less water, and give higher yields, just like I said earlier. According to some estimates, over half of the world's soy, a key ingredient to products ranging from candy bars to animal feed, comes from genetically modified strains. In 2005, about 8.5 million farmers in 21 countries were planting genetically altered seeds. So here we're going to talk about the benefits of GMOs. The first benefit is the increased yield. This is really big because in developing countries, the more you can produce, the better. The less space you have to use, the better. Herbicide-tolerant crops encourage less tilling and soil erosion. Insecticidal crops encourage less use of harmful pesticides. I think this is one of the biggest ones, because if you make crops, then instead of having to spray them every week with harmful pesticides that run off into the groundwater or into our rivers and lakes and ponds, then obviously I believe that's a really good thing. Using less harmful pesticides, just growing the crops where they can fight off the pests themselves. Virus-resistant crops. Now, I think this is extremely cool. Genetically altering a crop to where it can resist a virus. That's absolutely incredible to me. And the development of drought-resistant crops. The risks of GMOs include a possible allergic or other health responses in humans and livestock, creating new or more vigorous pests and pathogens. And that's definitely something. You've always heard the argument, don't use Germ-X, right? I've heard it too growing up. You know, they say if you use Germ-X, the more you use it, the more tolerant that bacteria and viruses will get to it. Now, that might just be an old wives' tale, but according to research of GMOs, it's possible that the pests and pathogens linked to these GMOs would make these pests become stronger and more apt to wreak havoc. Another risk of the GMOs include harm to non-target beneficial species, unwanted gene flow, and irreparable changes in species diversity and in genetic diversity within a species. So anytime that you're actually messing with the gene pool, it could be irreparable. One thing that would be important for researchers to do would be ensuring that they kept old genes from before they changed into the new genes. That way it's like holding over the old recipe, making sure you don't get rid of it while you try a new one, just in case. Now we're going to move into the United States' position. The US assumed Europeans would be okay with GMOs just like Americans were. Now obviously that was not the case, and that was something that was overlooked before they started marketing it in the other nations. The biotechnology companies felt their research did enough to prove their safety for human consumption. Again, that was also not the case for Europeans. They did not feel as if the research was legitimate, since no third-party research was done. Also, bans on the GMOs by the EU hurt the biotech company's reputation and wallet. This is probably one of the bigger reasons that you see the legal battle happening, is because when you hurt the company's reputation, that's one thing, but when you hurt their wallet, they'll be coming after you to make sure that they can continue to produce exactly what they need to and get it out to the people that they want. Lastly, the US decided to fight back with a legal battle. Continuing on with the US position, research done in the United States has been conclusive so far that humans are not at risk from the GMOs. Now, this is the position of the biotech industry, but again, Europeans did not buy it. The New York Times reported last year that about 90% of scientists believe GMOs are safe, a view endorsed by the American Medical Association, the National Academy of Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the World Health Organization. Again, Europeans didn't buy it. The US argued that the suppression of the distribution of acceptance of GMOs are hurting the developing nations that need to have some sort of crop excuse me, that they can grow in the conditions that they have. Like I mentioned earlier, if you're talking about countries in Africa and South America that are not fertile, that don't have a lot of rain, these countries are facing issues that cannot be solved just from hoping for more rain or buying more fertilizer. The GMOs could solve a lot of those problems, and the U.S. knows this, but the U.S. also knows that they can make a profit off of this, and that's seen as dirty money. There are numerous countries in South America and Africa that could benefit from GMOs, where insect drought and lack of fertilization are a serious threat to the ability of these regions to produce food for their populace. Now we're going to move into the European Union's position. The European Union did not take well to the United States introducing genetically modified foods on the continent and to the countries in the Union. There were multiple reasons for this opposition. Europeans and their food are deeply rooted in their culture. This means that the modification of the natural breeding habits and genetics of their produce is not an area that you want to mess with. 80% of Europeans are opposed to GMOs. That is a huge number, of the populace. To surmount an 80% disapproval rating of a product over an entire continent, that's going to be a huge daunting task. And the United States was willing to still give it a shot and try to change the minds of the Europeans. They really felt that they could do a lot of benefit with the GMOs, but regardless, the Europeans were not having it. I find it very interesting how deeply rooted that food is in their culture, because, well, you don't really see that quite as much for Americans, but when you see immigrants come from other countries into America, that's something that they bring with them. You can always see how culture and food from other nations is so deeply rooted, and I just find that incredibly interesting. Another reason Europeans didn't like the GMOs being introduced into European markets was because they feel that the United States moves unilaterally in foreign relations. So this wasn't even necessarily because of the GMOs, it was because Europeans didn't look at the United States favorably in foreign relations. So this was a political issue that the Europeans felt that the United States was just stepping over their bounds. In other words, Europeans will oppose actions made by the United States just because they want to express an empowerment of the people of Europe. So the people of Europe want to stand together against the United States over something that they felt was against their culture and unsafe unsafe for them to consume in the first place. There was just this large distrust of the United States in what they wanted to do with the GMOs. The EU also felt that GMOs were economically motivated and did not want to give Americans the satisfaction of economic gain from it. I think that's kind of funny. You know, we run ourselves in a free market society, and when you produce something as incredible as a GMO that can be antiviral, anti-insect, survive a drought, still be able to grow without a lot of fertilizer, you know, you would think that that would just be an incredible accomplishment, and it would just, you know, get thrown off the shelves or bought off the shelves, you know, in an incredible fashion, but that just wasn't the case. So you just kind of never know sometimes with the market. Sometimes it works imperfectly. The EU cited health concerns for its legal battle with the United States. The United States had done research looking into the safety of GMOs that they were producing, but there is a catch. All of the research that was done on the GMOs was done by the biotechnology companies developing them. This drove the EU to call their bluff and become very skeptical of the results, since no third-party analysis was done. The EU ultimately enacted a ban on any GMO produce from the United States. This sent the two groups into a lengthy international legal battle that was decided by the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization ruled in 2006 that the ban on GMOs by the EU was illegal and that the US could export them to European nations. This battle did succeed, though, for the EU in requiring that the labeling of all genetically modified produce on the shelves of consumers so that they can make the choice for themselves on whether or not they want to consume GMOs. Now we're going to go right into our case questions. Case question number 2. How would you characterize the cultures of Europe, France and Germany, and the United States in terms of Hofstede's scheme? In what ways are the cultures similar, and in what ways do they differ? How might the differences influence approaches to disputes like this one? Hofstede's research into the cultures of nations across the world gave us a fantastic insight into what the characteristics define each culture. In this case, we will be looking at the differences and similarities in the cultures of the United States, Germany, and France. These countries are similar in that there is not a lot of separation between their masculinity. For individualism, though, the United States is clearly the standout. For France's power distance, there's a much larger difference than any other statistic. France is also the most unwelcome to uncertainty, and Germany is not far behind. This could explain why they don't like the idea of GMOs. Knowing these differences in culture could help the countries better understand how to deal with the introduction of new ideas into each other's cultures. Big idea here. The first one being that France is the most unwelcome to uncertainty, with Germany coming in second with these three nations. The United States is around 45%. That means that it depends really on what the issue is, on whether or not they're going to be welcome or unwelcome to the uncertainty. If we're talking about the stock market, Americans seem to be okay with risking it all. With GMOs, they seem to be fine with it as well. France and Germany, definitely not. Case question number 3. Why would an approach emphasizing substantial equivalence result in an outcome different from the outcome of a policy driven by the precautionary principle? And the reason for this is that these two policies create different results because they are different approaches to the GMOs altogether. With the substantial equivalence, if a GMO food is equivalent to the natural food in categories such as taste, nutrition, and function, then it's deemed the same by the FDA as the natural food. But the precautionary principle is that it's better safe than sorry, so that you can avoid any risks if you don't adopt the GMO altogether. Case question number 4. How might the United States and EU resolve differences such as this in the future? There's no telling for certain if the EU and the US will resolve any differences any better than they did with the GMOs, but I can offer some advice. First, don't assume that just because something is accepted by your own country doesn't mean that it'll be accepted by your neighbors across the pond. Of course, the pond being the Atlantic Ocean. Second, always have third-party groups that are independent of the source do research for the viability and safety of your products and or produce. This was a big reason that there was a lot of distrust with these GMOs from the Europeans and the EU. Lastly, take into account the cultures that you want to export your products to. Being a good marketing researcher can save you from a nightmare like this one. And this really did end up being a nightmare, because like I said earlier, it really hurt the reputation and the wallets of these biotech companies. Monsanto overview. Monsanto is a developer of GMOs using biotechnology. They were the company that was caught in a dispute between the United States and the European Union in their lawsuit with the World Trade Organization. The last thing Monsanto wanted to do was find themselves caught between a rock and a hard place, but yet they could not help it. Excuse me. They could not help it when the EU banned their products. Monsanto wanted to export their products to Europe and have them used by people all over the world. Unfortunately, they had to fight an international legal battle to do so. Monsanto claims that their produce is safe regardless of what the EU wanted Europeans to believe, and states, genetically modified crops undergo more testing and oversight before commercialization than any other agriculture product, including conventional non-GMO crops. On the top of the government safety approvals, genetically modified crop data had been reviewed by third-party scientific experts who agree they're safe. Monsanto believes that their products are not harmful and only produce a good service to farmers and consumers. The organization has made strides to make the crops more resistant to viruses and insects, and also allow for the growing of these crops in dry and unfertile areas of the world. Regardless of this, though, farmers in developing countries have still rejected the GMO seeds. Monsanto has opened themselves up to third-party research to help prove their legitimacy. I do think this will help a lot with consumers all over the world, and even those in the United States. Just because most Americans are okay with the GMOs doesn't mean everyone is. So to get everyone on board, having third-party research prove that GMOs are safe is a big, big building block on which the biotech companies can build off of. This has eased some tensions within the consumer base. Still, though, questions remain about the long-term effects of GMOs on humans. Since GMOs have not been around for too terribly long, long-term effects are still yet to see. So it will be interesting. Just like vaping, we will see the long-term effects. Short-term, it seems to be okay, but long-term, we will see, and time will tell. The works cited page is right here. I will give a few seconds to look over it, but all in all, that is the conclusion of my presentation. Thank you very much.